So according to Lamont Roach, Tank Davis was just too small. I thought this was an interesting and kind of controversial take from Lamont Roach, obviously putting on the performance of a lifetime, but was Tank really too small for Lamont? Let's get a little bit into it. Obviously, Tank, we know him as the knockout artist, was a very surprising fight to many of us. A lot of us knew that Lamont Roach was a credible opponent. We knew that he had the fundamentals, had the amateur pedigree, but could he hang in there with a guy like Tank, who's been stopping guys in and out? You know, every opponent that they lined him up against, he knocked them down, and every time it would be an outstanding performance from Tank. But this time we saw a change, a major change from the past fights that we've seen Tank in. And obviously Tank is a tremendous fighter. Tank is very entertaining to watch, but ultimately it wasn't that version of him that I was expecting. You know, I thought he'd be more locked in, clearly allowed a lot of outside factors get into his game plan, get into his brain, and affect his performance. I mean, Lamont Roach was obviously a tremendous fighter, a tremendous factor in that fight between Lamont and Tank, but ultimately that wasn't the version of Tank that I'm used to, nor is it the version of Tank that I expect to see in a rematch. I feel like Tank's room for growth is greater than Lamont's. Not to say that Lamont's a heavy underdog going into this rematch with Tank, but I feel like if Tank does, and this is a big if he's able to clear out all the distractions, he performs at a level that's more intense and his sense of urgency is greater from the opening bell, I feel like Tank will and should get the stoppage victory. Now, I don't want to take credit away from Lamont when I say this, but he didn't fight the best version of Tank. And I'm saying nobody's ever fought the best version of Tank, because Tank has constantly fought guys that had more aggressive styles, who don't really know how to box. Boxing's not their forte. Tank fights guys that run into shots. Historically, until he took this Lamont Roach fight, I actually respect Tank for taking this Lamont Roach fight, because for the first time it wasn't a clumsy opponent or a non-experienced opponent or a weight-drained opponent like we've always criticized Tank's resume for, but he fought somebody who was coming up in weight, and ultimately people, you know, started with that criticism, but look at what happened. He fought somebody who had that amateur experience, had the amateur pedigree, was a respectable pro, is a respectable pro, and ultimately we saw that in the ring because he didn't have to deal with the weight. You know, even though he was coming up, Roach was coming up in weight, Tank was still the smaller guy when it came to that ring, and it was apparent in there. You know, Lamont was hurting Tank at multiple points in the fight, and I feel like you could have easily given that fight to Lamont Roach. I personally thought Lamont deserved to win by a little bit, but because that knee that Tank took, for whatever reason, wasn't ruled a knockdown, I feel like a draw isn't crazy. And I think a lot of us get fooled just because Tank isn't knocking a guy out. That doesn't mean he lost every single round prior to the draw being a decision. You know the decision being a draw. Like, just because Tank didn't knock him out like he knocked Rolly out, like he knocked out Ryan, that doesn't mean he lost every single round. Just because we're watching the entire fight and expecting a knockout, some of us think that, you know, Lamont Roach won every round that Tank didn't knock him out, and that's not how boxing works. Just because we're not used to seeing Tank go the distance, we've only really seen it with Isaac Cruz, it doesn't mean that he lost every single round. So that's why I think it's a more competitive fight than people believe, and I think the rematch is going to be a really exciting fight. But to say that, for Lamont to say that Tank was the smaller opponent, that was interesting to me, because this is the guy coming up from 130 and he felt like Tank was the smaller guy. Yeah, Tank's not a huge guy to begin with. It's kind of interesting because I asked Tank, when's he going to move up to 140 before this Lamont Roach fight? I asked Tank, when is he going to move up to 140? But now, after seeing that Lamont Roach fight, I understand why Tank was telling me that he doesn't want to go up to 140, because he knows how dangerous it is. You know, he could get messed up, he could get cracked with a big shot, and we know that Tank, he'll take one to give one. That's his style. He's an exciting fighter. So I understand now, seeing Lamont Roach, a natural 130 pounder, come up to 35 and still be bigger than Tank. That's why Tank, we're probably never going to see him against a guy like Teofimo Lopez or against a guy like Devin Haney, because these guys are so much bigger than him. People don't understand how little Tank is. And coming from somebody that's interviewed Tank and seen him up close and personal, multiple times, I can tell you that Tank is not a big guy. I can tell you right now, the many times I've interviewed Tank, I've seen him up close and personal, he's little. So to sit here and say, you know, he should move up to 40 like I was suggesting, it was silly of me because he's not a big guy at all by any means. So Lamont Roach saying that Tank is little, I'm not, you know, mad at that take because I saw Lamont and I saw Tank fight week. Lamont looked about the same size, but in the ring, Lamont did look bigger. So, you know, Lamont, respect to him for having the fight of his life, but I feel like in a rematch, Tank is going to make the necessary adjustments and he's going to be more motivated to knock out Lamont than he was in the first fight. Now hearing all the backlash that Tank is getting for this draw performance that he had against Lamont, I feel like he's going to be coming with that fire, and I think he should be able to stop Lamont, you know, with, you know, his eyes on the prize and having tunnel vision and staying focused for this fight camp. So we'll see what happens. Let me know down below what you guys think, but thank you guys for watching another Naz Boxing video, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.